Hey everyone, this is Katie Novak and welcome to the Education Table, the podcast where we dive into inclusive education in 10 minutes or less. Today we're talking about Rubrics, an essential tool for progress monitoring and meaningful feedback. We'll explore the different types of rubrics, how AI can revolutionize rubric creation, and we'll talk about ways to use Rubric in the UDL framework to empower students with frequent feedback and lots of opportunities for revision. So let's get started. Let me take you back to my early days of using Rubrics. I loved the idea of providing clear expectations and standards for my students, but the process was painful. Grading with Rubrics took forever. Students didn't always understand what the rubric meant, and I often found that the rubrics weren't helping me identify next steps for instruction unless I held one-on-one conferences, which I just didn't have the time to do all the time with every student. And it was super frustrating because I knew the potential that rubrics had for clarity, transparency, and feedback, but I could not seem to make them work efficiently in my classroom. Now, fast forward to today, and rubrics have become so much more efficient for me. And why is that? It's because I've learned how to leverage the right types of rubrics for the right purposes. I've been much more clear about using examples and non-examples to clarify expectations in the rubric. And I've learned to incorporate tools like AI to streamline the process. So let's dive into how you can do the same. Now, research is clear that rubrics are powerful learning tools because they provide a very clear framework for what success looks like, which is super important in any classroom. Now, according to research, rubrics enhance transparency in assessment and help students focus on learning targets rather than trying to guess what it is that the teacher expects. But not all rubrics are created equal, and knowing when and how to use the different types of rubrics is key. Now, this is where AI comes in. AI tools like a ChatGPT can help you create standards-based rubrics in seconds. You can input your learning objectives and then let AI generate a really detailed rubric aligned with those standards. Even better, AI does a really nice job of stripping away irrelevant constructs so students aren't graded on things that aren't construct relevant. That's really meaning that it's not part of the standard, so we don't need to assess students on it. This makes rubrics so much more focused on what truly matters, which is mastery of the learning target. So before we talk about application and the strategies that we can use, let's break down the three main types of rubrics and how to use each of them effectively. So the simple breakdown of the three types is essentially that there is analytic, there's holistic, and there is the single point. And for a visual breakdown of each, I have linked examples in the show notes. So first, analytic rubrics. This type breaks down a task into specific criteria with each scored separately. It typically includes multiple rows and columns, providing students with detailed feedback on strengths and areas for improvement. Analytic rubrics are ideal for helping students see exactly where they need to improve, where they're doing well, and it allows them to track progress over time because it does isolate criteria. Now, that's different from a holistic rubric, which provides a single overall score based on general performance levels, such as approaching, mastering, or exceeding standards. While it's much quicker to grade something on a holistic rubric, it offers less detailed feedback compared to an analytic rubric. Holistic rubrics are great for formative assessments where you're going to provide targeted feedback to small groups, for example, or when you need a really big picture view of student performance. So they have their place, certainly, but may not be as useful for students to really figure out what is it that they have to improve and what have they done well already. Now, the last type of rubric is the single point rubric. And this type is really just focused on what it would take to meet expectations. A single point rubric only outlines the criteria for success, and then there's space to provide qualitative feedback on strengths and areas for growth. So imagine the mastery column of an analytic rubric, but there's no column for what it might look like if students are approaching or exceeding the criteria. Now, single point rubrics are excellent for encouraging revision, having conversations with students. It's not overwhelming because there's not too many categories, but ultimately it is a heavy lift as an educator to really think about how do you explain what is done well, and then how do you share really specific targets for what a student can do to improve. Now, each type serves a very unique purpose, and the choice of the rubric really depends on your assessment goals and how much feedback you're hoping to provide based on the goal and based on the assessment. So let's dive into strategies that will help you to figure out when and how to use each of the rubrics, and how the robots can help you do this really efficiently and really effectively. So let's start with the strategies. First, let's talk about how AI can make rubrics easier to create and use. All the AI tools out there can help you to generate rubrics, but to get the best results, be sure to share actual grade level standards and any success criteria, and specify the type of rubric you want. So as an example, as a former 7th grade English teacher, I might enter something like, I teach 7th grade, and I would like to create a holistic 3-point standards-based rubric based on the standard, compare and contrast a fictional portrayal of a time, place, or character, and a historical account of the same period as a means of understanding how authors of fiction use or alter history. Can you please provide that to me in a table? So I really have to do the work to be super, super specific. This is the grade that I'm teaching. This is the standard that I'm working on. This is the rubric that I want. This is how many points it needs to be. And this is the format that I want it in. Now, the second strategy is once I have the rubric, and again, I might have to go back and forth to get it perfect for the use, but ultimately, once I have the rubric, it's really helpful to have examples and non-examples to make expectations really clear for students. I love to hand out a rubric with a bunch of examples and say, where do these fall on the rubric and how do you know? And so you can provide the rubric and your grade level to an AI tool and ask it to create examples for each of the rubric scores. And then students can annotate the examples, determine the score, and then use that to better understand their own self-assessments. They can do it to better support each other if they do peer reviews. So it's a really great way to help them internalize success criteria. Now, the last great thing we can do with rubrics is to use them as a formative assessment tool for revision. So rubrics should not just appear at the end of a project. They're really a tool for learning along the way. So incorporate formative assessments early and often aligned to the rubric. So give students the rubric at the start of an assignment, and then they can self-assess, and peer review and look at exemplars, for example. Then at key checkpoints, you can say, okay, let's take a moment. Let's look at the rubric. How are you doing here? Where do you think you're at? And this builds in a lot of opportunities for revision, because you can just walk around, check in with students and say, based on what I can see, this is where you are right now. Let's talk about next steps. This allows for lots and lots and lots of reiterations of the work before the final submission. And when you're thinking about peer and self-assessment, consider inviting your robot friends into this process. Teaching students how to use any AI tools available to them in the district to get kind of the lower kind of cognitive feedback can be really helpful. So for instance, maybe your school use something like Brisk AI, and they can use a draft of their essay and ask for, Jess, can you give me some feedback here just about the construction? They might ask, what can I do to improve my thesis statement? Particular question. And this creates more frequent feedback loops. It empowers students to take ownership of their learning. It will help them figure out how to ask the right questions. But ultimately, it allows us to have those really, really deep conversation about the core and the heart of writing, which we need to highlight student voice. Rubrics are a powerful tool for progress monitoring, but they're even more impactful when paired with UDL principles. By using the right type of rubric, incorporating exemplars and formative assessments, and leveraging AI for efficiency, we really can create a learning environment where students get the support they need and are empowered to take ownership of their growth. Thank you so much for tuning into the Education Table. Check out the show notes for rubric templates and AI tips to streamline your practice. As always, onward.